In this video, we'll be meeting the following two learning targets. We'll be able to multiply integers and explain how multiplication works, and then we'll be able to divide integers and explain how division works. So to begin, we're going to look at what multiplication actually represents. So I have two different multiplication problems on the screen, and I'm going to walk you through how to visually represent multiplication. So what multiplication here says is 8 times 4, but what this really means is you have 8 groups of 4. So let's draw that out. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4. So there's 4 groups of 4. 6 groups of 4, and 8 groups of 4. So there we can see our 8 groups of 4. And if we count up each individual dot, so in the first line we have 4, 8, 12, we have 16 by the end of this line, and then we have 20, 24, 28, 32. So if I take 8 groups of 4 and visually represent it, I end up with 32 dots. That's why 8 times 4 is 32, because we have 8 groups of 4, and then we count how many individual dots we actually have. So once we understand multiplication at a basic level, we now need to talk about the two rules that exist that help us to determine if our multiplication problem is going to end up as positive or negative. So there are two main rules with multiplication. The first says when multiplying two integers with the same sign. So this means we're multiplying something like a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative. So we have two numbers with the same sign. When we're multiplying two numbers with the same sign, the result is positive. So what this means is if we have something like a positive 4 times a positive 5, the answer is going to be 20. But similarly, if we have negative 4 times negative 5, because we have a negative times a negative, two negatives being multiplied, our answer will also be 20. Now, on the flip side of that, when we're multiplying two integers with different signs, so we have a positive times a negative, or a negative times a positive. When this is happening, the result is going to be negative. So what this means is if we have a positive 4 times a negative 5, because we have a positive times a negative, opposite signs, we get negative 20. Or if we have a negative 4 times a positive 5, again, because we have a negative times a positive, one of each, our answer will also be negative 20. So now we're going to apply the previous two slides together. So notice here that I have 10 times negative 3, which tells me 10 groups of negative 3, which I know 10 times 3 would give me 30. And then because I have a positive times a negative, two different signed numbers, my answer would be negative 30. Then if I switch and look at 7 times 5, I know 7 times 5 is 7 groups of 5, which is 35. And then because I have a positive times a positive, two numbers with the same sign, my result is a positive 35. Then if I look down at negative 4 times negative 6, I know this is looking at 4 groups of 6, which is 24. And then because I have a negative times a negative, two negative numbers, my result is a positive. So the next thing we're going to look at is what do we do when we have multiple multiplications? And this works just like addition, where we move, just like we read a book, from left to right. So we're going to apply that same idea here. So in the first problem, we're going to start with the one on the most left, which is 4 times 5. So that becomes 20 times then negative 2, which is negative 40. So again, noting I moved from left to right. So now we're going to jump in and look at what does division actually represent in a problem. So here I have two different problems, and we're going to break it up into visual representations for you. So here we have 8 divided by 4. And what this is saying is take 8 and divide it into 4 equal groups. So what I like to do is I like to draw buckets. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I like to divide the 8 evenly into those buckets. So I'll just start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 divided evenly into 4 buckets gives me 2, and this is essentially pieces per bucket or pieces per group. So when you're dividing, you're actually saying, okay, if I take 8 and divide it into 4 groups, how many will be in each group? The answer is 2. And just like with multiplication, dividing has rules as well when it comes to determining whether the result will be positive or negative. Luckily, these dividing rules are the exact same as multiplication. So we can quickly write those down because we already know our multiplication rules. So essentially here, if we have two numbers with the same signs, we have a positive divided by a positive or a negative divided by a negative. The results of that problem, if we have two positives or two negatives, will be positive, just like if we multiply two positives together or multiply two negatives together. Then, on the flip side of that, when dividing two integers with different signs, we have a positive divided by a negative or a negative divided by a positive. Just like with multiplication, when you have one of each, that result is going to be negative. So now we're going to take those division rules and apply them to the problems we see on the screen. So the first problem that I see is 33 divided by negative 3. And I know 33 divided into 3 groups would produce 11 items per group, and because I have a positive and a negative number, my result is negative. The next one, I know that the division sign looks a little different, but this is just a different way of writing division. Here I have negative 40 divided by 8, which means I'm taking 40 and dividing it into 8 groups, which means 5 items per group. And because I have a negative and a positive, my result is negative. The last thing we're going to look at is what we do if we have multiple divisions. And just like we saw with multiplication, we are going to move from left to right, just like we read a book. So here we have 20 divided by 2, which is 10. 10 divided by negative 2 is negative 5.